Hello? Yeah, just me. Hello? Yeah. Time to go. Time to go, everyone. Time to go. Okay, folks. Bill Tufts, I'm going to pick on you. You'll have to get those people in your area to sit down. Jim Ness. Okay, folks. Hi, David Hines. Yeah, let's go. Okay, folks, let's get started. Thank you, Stockwell. We had some really interesting questions from Stockwell's presentation that sort of got us a little bit tight for time. Okay, everybody. The fellow that asked the last question in the last series, his name was Ian McCormick. He told you that. He's over at that corner. He's, besides talking about the Bank Act, he also has a book over there that I think is one of the 3 books that John talked about at our first conference. It's called The Law by Frederick Bastiat. But anybody wants a good, easy read, it's over at the back table there. They want a few dollars for it, but it's something, I think Paul Himman said his grandpa bought it for him when he was 14 years old. So all you people that are running around with your chest stuck out talking about your 14-year-old grandchildren, get them a copy of the Bastiat. Maybe they'll grow up to be just like us someday. So anyway, let's get started. We're running. I think the timer has run down. Eric Lowther wanted to make a little bit of a pitch for the Epoch Times, and I said, oh, well, there's hardly ever any questions. We'll just do it at the end of, I think he and Stockwell were colleagues for years, and I said, we'll just do it at the end of Stockwell's presentation, but as it turned out, there was enough questions in Stockwell's that we ran out of time, so we're just going to let Eric, where are you? Yeah, Eric's just going to make a quick presentation about the Epoch Times here, and then we'll get on with our schedule with Michelle Sterling. Welcome, Eric. Go ahead. I think you've...
Thank you, Dan. Yes, thank you, Dan. Thank you so much. And great presentation, Stockwell. I thought Stockwell's presentation echoed a lot of the stuff in your book text on the wokeism and the cultural communism. And also what was great about Stockwell's presentation was he didn't just leave us with all the bad news. He gave us some things to do about it. So what I'm going to talk about quickly is just the Epoch Times. You know, if the media had been honest with us all the way through all this, we'd be in a different place today than we are. The Epoch Times helped me a lot with some of the understanding of what was going on, and I'm helping them a little bit. The Epoch Times and Epoch TV was founded and is mostly managed, in fact, by people who hold to a meditative spiritual practice which has been severely persecuted in communist China. It's known as a Falun Gong. And I, as a person who holds a biblical worldview, I respect their efforts to stand against evil. And I hope someday they come to accept the truth of the transformative power of Jesus Christ and Christianity's power to impact culture positively. That said, they do provide an excellent media product. And you know, as much as the government and everybody has been pushing and our media has been pushing a very dark propaganda type agenda, it's opened up all alternatives for other kinds of media. You know, I subscribe to Western Standard and I have a Rebel subscription, but Epoch Times is one I think we must all include, and probably many of you do here already. I'm just going to click over to Roman. Roman is a guy that works for Epoch Times, and a little video from him, and he has a show called Facts Matter. He also recently produced a documentary called No Farmers, No Food, and that's worth watching on Epoch TV if you have a subscription. Now, Dave, do I point this clicker at you, or where do I point it? You'll do it? Okay, give me one. So there's just some of the background there. And they have a Canadian version, of course, also U.S. and World News, print, digital, video, and stream. Let's go to the next one there, and we'll just click it in.
Over the last few years, many
No, it shouldn't be that sound.
Okay, hold on. Let me see where that sound's coming from. Could be,
Over the last few years, over the last few
I don't know if you can see the bottom there, but unfortunately you can't hear his presentation, but he's talking about Canada and our values being assailed by socialist and communist policies, which are really destroying the fabric of our nation, the media outlets that perpetuate the problem, and it's hard to find the true facts. Even worse, many people have begun to lose trust in institutions and they feel hopeless about it. We're wondering if there's anything you can actually do to reverse the tide. And he's telling us, yes, there is something you can do. You can subscribe to Epoch Times, which many of you probably do. I hope you encourage others to as well. The fact is that Canada and Canadians deserve a media that tells them the truth and cares about Canadian interests, Canadian values. And they're truly an independent outlet. They don't take any government funding at all. They depend on subscriptions and donations, and they have grown to the 4th largest media actually in the U.S. They are independent, as I say, and they have a Canadian version and that focuses on Canadian values and Canadian freedom. And I have on my card at the back, you can click on a QR code to subscribe if you haven't already. There's some of the content they have. Many people who do subscribe barely touch on the content they have. They have a great broad variety of deep content, including Canadian video and Canadian news. And they recently interviewed Danielle and did a very deep interview on her. And special reports, infographics, documentaries, and so if you want to know anything more about them, or if you used to subscribe to them and maybe you don't anymore, they keep improving their platform, and they have a lot of good content. Maybe we'll go to the next slide there, Dave. And in addition, you know, they got good opinion area, opinion commentary, and John Robson, who is one of our hosts today, is often featured in the Epoch Times. And Conrad Black, of course, John Carpe, Preston Manning. A lot of these people are there in the opinion pages. And Peter Menzies, who used to actually be, he doesn't list it in his background, but he used to be the publisher of the Calgary Herald. That's when I knew him. And Jeffrey Tucker and a whole bunch of other good people. And you can get it all for less than 15 cents a day, no contract. You cancel anytime if you want. If you want to get it delivered to your home in a paper format, it comes like this. Paper format, this is today's version. I have 25 copies. If you want one at the back, just come and grab one. I'm glad to give you one for free. And they deliver it right to your door. And I think that's it. The key is, I think, I'm so grateful at this conference, Danny, that you're recognizing the need for prayer, and we're looking for a higher power to help us. We need to all stand together to get the truth, the true message out, and the fact that people matter, and let's stand together and get the truth out. Thanks, Dan and John, for hosting this today. Thank you.
Nicely done, Eric. Yeah, I think that, like, I mean, if everybody takes a look, we've got lots of different, the alternative media, if you want to call it that, and if we all took a little bit of our money, when Stephen Harper was, we were talking about the CBC, I suggested to them at one point in time, why don't you just take the $1.2 billion, and I think it's $2 billion a year now subsidy to the CBC, I said, why don't you just, like, if you insist on continuing to do it, which they have, well, you know, how many governments have we had promise they would do something about it, but they never do? But I said, just take the $2 billion subsidy and share it up by viewers and listeners. Like, then all these people, independent people that are doing a little bit of work, they'd be getting their share of the CBC, and of course there'd be nobody watching the CBC, but it wouldn't matter because they wouldn't be getting $2 billion of our money. But in any event, that's just my after 2 o'clock rant. And so, we're just absolutely thrilled. I don't see Michelle at the moment. She must be here somewhere. Oh, what? Oh, stole the clicker. Okay, well, see, talk about telling the truth. Oh, here's Michelle Sterling. I remember, yeah, I think the first time we met, we were upstairs in the International Hotel about 10 or 12 or 15 years ago. Michelle has become an important part of what we do and a very dear friend, and I think I've used enough of her time, so please welcome Michelle Sterling. I think she'll have a very informative presentation, as she always does. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Hello, everyone. I'm speaking for myself today. This is a very contentious issue, but I think it's a very important issue to discuss. And my purpose is to try and bring some historical insights to this topic, hopefully to help heal the rift in Canada and to help people see the geopolitical impacts of what's going on. And so I think I'm short on time, so I might have to skip through it, but I will post the PowerPoint on my website so that you can go through and read all the fine print, because I'm not going to read everything that you see on the screen. So it's called How UNDRIP Jumped the Shark on the Graves of Innocents. UNDRIP is the UN Declaration of Rights for Indigenous People. Oops. Oh, did you change that? Yeah, okay. So, when Tucker Carlson was in Alberta, he said that if you're on the side of burning churches, you're on the wrong side. And he said that people have noticed a very radical change in Canada in the past few years when churches are burned to the ground, when peace-loving Christians have their religious facilities vandalized, and there's little outcry from the public, little apparent follow-up or charges by police, and statements that such violence is understandable made by the government. Well, there's something terribly wrong. So what's wrong is mass graves and UNDRIP, the balkanization of Canada. And as the theme of the conference, Freedom Talk, the decline and fall of the West, our choice. So on May 27th, 2021, this happened. The Tecumloops or Kamloops First Nation confirms bodies of 215 children buried in the former Kamloops Indian Residential School site. And with that, Canada went from being a peacekeeper to a genocidal global pariah. Now look at these headlines. Remains, mass graves, bodies, genocide. Oops, I'm not very good with the clicker. Discovery of Indigenous children's bodies, a reminder of Canada's genocide. When has Canada ever been convicted of genocide? Never, never. And experts are saying this. Who are these experts? So, most people don't know that this wasn't just an announcement from the Kamloops Band. The federal government was informed of the finding and did no due diligence. So they accepted the Kamloops Band's claim without question. Why? And how many people know that on October the 27th, 2022, the entire House of Commons voted to describe Indian residential schools as genocide? Anyone know that? Hardly anyone in this room knew that. So where are our politicians standing up for our country? Why aren't they? And then in 2023, they had a moment of silence for a phantom genocide. And as Harrison Faulkner reported, no remains have been discovered. Like, what's going on, Canada? So what constitutes genocide? Well, the intent to destroy, and then there's 5 principles here: killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about their destruction, imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. So the main principle that most people are relying on when they say there was a genocide in Canada is the alleged forcible transfer of children from one group to another group, and that there was an intent to destroy. I have a different historical view. I spent about a decade of my life in and out of the Glenbow Museum. I spent 3 years on the road interviewing hundreds of pioneers, mostly in southern Alberta. Some of them were descendants of the people who signed Treaty 7, including descendants of Colonel MacLeod. My research supervisor was Dr. Hugh Dempsey, Potena, an honorary chief with the Blackfoot Nation, married into the Blackfoot Nation. So in fact, the chiefs requested residential schools. They granted reserve land for residential schools. There was a loyalty tour, and I believe it was 1883, where a Mohawk surveyor told Sir John A. Macdonald, please bring the Western chiefs to Eastern Canada, show them what's happening in the country, take them to the Mohawk Industrial School, show them how they can teach their children to be ready for the future. Show them that you're not going to kill them. Why did he say that? Because across the medicine line, the border in the United States, the U.S. cavalry had been killing Indians and waging Indian wars from 1644 to 1924. That's how long it continued. So that's why the Mounties were dressed in red, to differentiate them from the bluecoats, from these murderous cavalry. And in the U.S., the view of Indian people was very, very different than in Canada. In Canada, we had hundreds of years of friendly, peaceful trade relations. In the U.S., from the beginning, it was a battle over whose land was whose. A settler would stake land, a tribe would say, that's our land. Someone would shoot one or the other. There'd be a war, the cavalry would come in. So the history in the U.S. is really Boot Hill, the Saloon, and then Boot Hill. And in Canada, the history is the Mission Outpost and then the Mountie Outpost. So parents enrolled their children. They had to fill out an admission form. And on the form, if you look at the red arrow, it says religion. And right beside this person's religion, it says, are Catholic. That means the family was already a Catholic family. Most of the Native people in Canada adopted Christianity decades before the residential schools opened. So how is this genocide? The chiefs wanted residential schools. They wanted education for their children. They offered land to build the schools on, and they also went to the east and they saw the model for an industrial school. But you say, oh, well, we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and that was not their finding. Well, when truth and reconciliation begins with lies, you got a problem. This was a sign at the kiosk at the entryway of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it starts by saying, students living at the residential schools faced experiences which, for the most, ranged from degradation to abuse and death. Looks like anyone who had a good experience would never be heard. Their parents, left behind in communities devoid of children, suffered as well. Well, only a third of the eligible children ever went to Indian residential schools. So the community was not devoid of children. And as time progressed, day schools were built on the reserve. So there was no obligation to go to a residential school. If there was a day school, you could send your child there. So they were not forced. And then it says in 1920, it became punishable by imprisonment to refuse to send an Aboriginal child to a residential school. Well, that was to align with provincial truancy laws, because if any of you have your child registered in public school and they don't show up at school, you better believe that the truancy officers are going to show up at your door. And if it's not a problem in the family that is solved by social welfare, at some point you'll go to jail too. And in 1933, they say, principals were given guardianship of the children attending the schools, stripping away their parents' rights. Well, every child who goes to school under in loco parentis, which means in place of the parent. And so the school becomes as if the parent and has that parental authority during the time that the child is at the school. So this is being misrepresented. So, oops, I think I went too far. Nope, sorry. Okay, so Robert Carney is a historian, and he's actually the father of Mark Carney, the very famous Mark Carney, former Bank of Canada governor. And he wrote that, this is of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, he wrote, it would have been fair to acknowledge in the Royal Commission report that many traditional Indian residential school boarding schools, in some cases well into the 20th century, took in sick, dying, abandoned, orphaned, physically and mentally handicapped children, from newborns to late adolescents, as well as adults who asked for refuge and other forms of assistance. So, based on that, you can be pretty sure that you probably will find a couple of unidentified graves, but they'll be of people who are unrelated to the school. So, oddly, the world's most influential Catholic is silent. That's Mark Carney, his son. He's silent about the churches burning, and he's silent about his father's legacy. Isn't one of the commandments to honor your father and mother? Isn't another one to not bear false witness? But indeed, how can we account for the fact that thousands of residential school students, former students, are convinced that people disappeared? Many people in Indigenous communities know that people just disappeared. They know it. Well, tuberculosis. So people have forgotten that TB used to be the biggest killer of all people in Canada, in the world, actually. And there was no cure for it. For a long time, people thought it was hereditary, and then that was kind of okay because obviously it just ran in that family. Then they found out that it was a transportable bacillus. And that was not okay because all of a sudden people were afraid if they found out that someone in your family had TB, well, they didn't want to associate with you. People could get kicked out of their living circumstance, their house, their rental apartment. They might lose their job because you were potentially contagious. So I really recommend that everyone watch this American documentary, The Forgotten Plague. And I want to read this little excerpt here. This is from Moffat et al. 2013, talking about Aboriginal family, where my brother went to the sanatorium and stayed there for 7 years. I never knew my brother. My older sister has no memory of him. My siblings never met their brother until he was 13. He was a total stranger. That's the emotional part. We had a brother that we never knew. And this was a very common experience, not only in the Indigenous community, everywhere, but people may have been in the sanatoriums, not just for months, for years. So they completely lost touch with their culture, with their family, and they were total strangers when they returned. So it's like they disappeared. Now, TB used to be called the captain of all these men of death. It most commonly affects the lungs, and quite often it's kind of almost like an abscess that you get, a tubercle that will fill up with the bacillus, and at some point it hemorrhages. So we often hear stories from former students saying, oh, there was blood all over the room, obviously someone was murdered. Well, quite often you would have somebody having one of these hemorrhages, and it would be horrible. And obviously, all of the bedding and clothing, you couldn't just wash it and reuse it because it was full of a contagion. So it probably was burned, and we often hear stories of things being burned in incinerators. Well, guess what was probably being burned? And we often hear how the students hated the fact that they often had to scrub the halls and scrub the walls and scrub the guardrails on the stairs. Well, it's because public sanitation became an obsession as soon as people learned that, oh, the bacillus can be transmitted. Many of the children also had TB, especially like orphans. They couldn't refuse admission to orphans, even if their family had died of TB, and even if the orphan probably had TB. But in some schools, they did have a separate a floor or section of the school where they kept the more ill children, either until they recovered or they were sent on. So I believe really what's happening is that the Indigenous community, especially with the many fentanyl deaths that are going on now, is suffering from ambiguous losses, which is a psychological assessment term. And it really refers to, you know, a sudden, dramatic, unexpected disappearance, death of a person that you love or know. And this example is from history, but I think it will give you a good idea of why many people would think that people disappeared whenever they went to residential schools. So this is from Hudson Bay Trading Post in Albany. A father showed up saying there's no food in the family tent and that his wife was quite ill, and he died. So the Hudson's Bay sent out men with food only to find the family in a tent, the mother deceased, with 5 children around her. A 2-month-old baby was given up to a relative. The 16-year-old joined another relative on a hunt. And the remaining 3 children, a boy and 2 girls, came to the residential school. And during a flu epidemic, the youngest of the 3 died at that school. Those 3 children would never, ever have gone back to their reserve, not in the summer or anything, because they didn't have any family. But for that community, that day, 7 people, a whole family was decimated, and only 5 of those people disappeared. Right? So only the 16-year-old remained. I don't know what he would remember of that event. He would remember that his siblings went to residential school and they never came back. And who knows what the 2-month-old grew up thinking. So where was the location of death? So at the schools, 423 students died, most of them of TB. This is from the Truth and Reconciliation Report, and they do count other numbers here, but of course, we can't claim that people who died in a sanatorium died there because of an Indian residential school. They had TB. They may have had it before they got there. But anyway, so 423 students out of 150,000 over the period of 113 years doesn't sound like genocide to me, even though every one of those deaths was tragic. But what does UNDRIP have to do with this? Well, 6 provinces had objected to UNDRIP, and the Kamloops find ended that objection. So you see the first National Post item, 6 provinces were objecting. They wanted to know what consent meant. They wanted to know what veto rights would be. They wanted more definition. Even in April, the Liberals' bill on Indigenous rights getting pushback from Conservatives and First Nation critics. So April 14th that was, and boom, whoops, sorry. Boom, May 27th, the find at Kamloops. And UNDRIP passed into law June 21st, less than a month later. And the day after that, how many people in this room know that China has accused Canada of committing genocide? Not very many people. China has accused us of committing genocide, and they cite the Kamloops find. So what was happening is that Canada was just about to accuse China of genocide over the Uyghurs. And this is from the Washington Post, and look at this. They're saying the remains of 215 children, and oops, they're also, sorry, they're also saying the remains found in Canada included those of Indigenous children as young as 3. Shocking Canadians. Well, it shocked the entire world, but was it true? And now we have dueling demands on genocide, China and the Uyghurs versus Canada and the Indians. Well, just to be clear, while Canada was providing education, food, clothing, and skills to Indigenous children, China was starving 40 million of its own people in a state-sponsored genocide, a real one. Now, tuberculosis was the biggest killer of all Canadians until the 1950s. And you can see on the graph, in the early days, TB was really taking away a lot of children at the schools. Most of them came there already infected. I believe something like 93% were evaluated to have come with TB. And TB in a small child can be what's called latent TB, so it has no symptoms. And you know, over time it may become exacerbated. But this is an interesting point that the entire family of Stephen Kakfe's mother was wiped out by tuberculosis. His mother was in TB treatment off and on for 6 of the first 12 years of his life, and he's the husband of the Truth and Reconciliation Commissioner, Murray Wilson. So you'd think they would have figured this out. But it seems like a genocide theme had been in the works for some time. This is academic scholar and author Frances Whittleson standing by a cairn at Kamloops, and she's a contributor to Grave Error, this book. And this is what ground-penetrating radar can see. It can see disturbances. It can't see bodies, remains, or coffins, and the only thing that happened in Kamloops was some ground-penetrating radar. Now, the RCMP, curiously, started an investigation. Murray Sinclair, who was one of the TRC commissioners, said that they were being too aggressive, especially with the young GPR operator, and so they handed the investigation over to the band. This is supposedly the site of a mass murder committed by nuns and priests in the middle of the night, and the RCMP are called off, and it's handed over to the band who claim to be the victims. This is unheard of. Is it sacred ground, or are these old septic trenches? If you look at the previous land use, they're old septic trenches filled with clay tiles. And that's probably what GPR found. Now, curiously, these ENGOs have some kind of a very big interest in this whole issue. They, if it's genocide, there are implications like legal action, like reparations, like land back. And look at David Suzuki Foundation really pushing the whole land back thing and claiming that land back is people returning back and finding their place in those systems of life, and that the people should include some access to territories and resources in a more equitable fashion for us to have control over how that actually looks. So, I don't know if people realize it, but there are 634 First Nation communities in Canada. They represent more than 50 nations and 50 Indigenous languages. So it sounds like when you say First Nation, that sounds big, right? But then you find out that there's 1.8 million Indigenous people in Canada, but the First Nation bands are actually quite small in number. Like the Six Nations of the Grand River is about 12,000 people. That's not even a city. And the Kamloops band here, it says that there's 1,785 people and 990 are reportedly non-Aboriginal. So the whole premise of land back is that these bands would get land back and have nation-to-nation negotiations with Canada. Now, it just so happens that most Indigenous people live on territory where all of Canada's treasure chest of critical minerals are. And it just so happens also that the UN is pushing this theme of the Indigenous keepers of the land as if they have special spiritual skills. And there's also this group called the Land Guardians. And it's also curious that at Davos, like just imagine at Davos with the World Economic Forum, if they had a Catholic priest on stage blessing the people and offering the sacraments. No, they had a shamanic ritual. And so this Catholic priest is asking, what spirit rules Davos? Well, just as was mentioned by Mark Morano, the consultant class and the climateers want to trade nature-based carbon offsets. The nations would be the keepers and be paid climate money. And can you make it go back one? Sorry, thanks. So carbon offsets equals Enron all over again. Carbon offsets are the lack of delivery of an invisible substance to no one. And curiously, people are willing to pay a lot of money for that. Now, part of the problem is that this lady, Kimberly Murray, is the special interlocutor for missing children and unmarked burials. But she's a lawyer, she's not a historian. So when she looks at history and she sees children in a graveyard with crosses, and this is what's in her most recent report, she claims that that's genocide. But she's not giving people the historical context that I've just given you, like about TB. And she's filing these unvetted human rights accusations at the UN with the special rapporteur. Did anybody know that? Anyone? No? Yeah, well, that's one that she sent to the special rapporteur. So after he came and visited here, he decried the appalling legacy of residential schools. I wonder why. guess what? She filed another one with the expert mechanism on human rights. Now, that's not her job. Her job was to report to the Justice Minister not to make statements on behalf of Canada that's based on hearsay evidence from former students of what they observed when they were children, when they may not have understood the context of what was happening, like being taken away to school when you're 5. Well, if you're not aware of the fact that your parents have died and you're now an orphan, and you just see that as a bunch of mean old people taking you away from the people you loved, then we have a problem. Now, I don't know if you know this, but actually, Canada is deemed guilty without trial or evidence. 22 lawyers, Canadian lawyers, most of them from Alberta, actually sent a letter to the International Criminal Court asking for Canada to be investigated for crimes against humanity and genocide. So, you know, we're pretty much being made guilty in the public, you know, trial by public, not by court, and with no evidence. And now Kimberly Murray just has a new report out, as I showed you, and she's saying that the history of residential school cemeteries is evidence of genocide. No, it's not. Cemeteries are evidence that we are all mortal. So ask these questions. Who were the children? There's no list of names of the missing children. There's no file of missing persons filed with the police over 113 years where a person was not found. Who are the families? How did they die? When did the parents or guardians report them missing? And why are the police not investigating? Now, of course, you'll say, well, wait a minute, there's the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and they have a memorial banner with 4,000 names of children on it. Except if you look closely at it, you find that one of the names is that of a young murder victim, nothing to do with the school, an 85-year-old, a person who died of a gunshot wound, a train accident. There are all kinds of names there where families obviously wanted to remember someone they loved, and they just added them to this register, but there's nothing to do with residential schools. So unfortunately, we are paying de facto reparations, and I recommend that people read this report by Dr. Tom Flanagan for the Fraser Institute. The tab is up over $60 billion now. It's a huge drain on our GDP. And the reason why this is happening, the reason why this is happening is that before Jody Wilson-Raybould left office, she told the departmental lawyers to seek negotiated settlements instead of litigating vigorously. So what's happening is people are coming forward and saying, well, I was abused at school and things were bad and terrible and awful and I deserve money. Okay, here's some money. So there is a settlement agreement called the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, IRSSA, I think it is. And people were given a base rate, a common experience payment. They could apply for an individual experience payment, which required them to have an interview with some arbitrator of some kind. But there was no litigation. No one ever had to prove any of these charges. So the upshot is that land title and resource development is turning upside down, just as the 6 provincial leaders feared. And if you look at this map closely, you'll see that all the seaport access in Canada is being blocked off by these, they're called Project Finance for Permanence initiatives. So these would be permanent conservation areas under Indigenous supervision. And further to that, who has been funding this? Well, the Pew Charitable Trusts out of the United States. For more than 2 decades, Pew has supported Indigenous-led conservation, including since the late 1990s in the Northwest Territories. Along with other partners, Pew provided direct financial assistance to First Nations to engage in land use planning, to establish Indigenous protected and conserved areas, and expand Indigenous guardian programs. So that's foreign interference in my books. Now, here is a recent land back deal in BC. BC as a province adopted UNDRIP under provincial law. The other provinces have not done that. So there's the federal UNDRIP, and BC adopted, I think it's called DRIPA there. Anyway, in this land back deal, the province of BC, probably unconstitutionally, gave Haida Gwaii, the former Queen Charlotte Islands, back to the Haida Nation. Boom, like that. But this represents a national security risk. In World War II, Colonel Mitchell said that he who controls Alaska controls the world. And that big round thing is an elephant radar that the US military built in the Haida Islands back in the day. They're not using it right now, but you can see that's only one of 3 in the world, so obviously this is a strategic point. And it looks like the Catholic Church has also lost its mind because they made an agreement with the Kamloops band, a sacred covenant, and they're actually also rewriting history there, saying that Father Lejeune and these 2 chiefs went and visited the Pope in 1904 to petition his support for Indigenous jurisdiction and title over Indigenous lands. We actually have the Chinook Wawa original writings about this, and that's not what it says. But, you know, if you're talking about nation-to-nation discussions, the Vatican is the world's smallest nation. So one way to get recognized as a nation is to have another nation recognize you. So our international reputation has been ruined, and there may be more risks ahead. If you recall when South Africa was accused of apartheid and other kinds of crimes, there were trade embargoes and all kinds of things that happened. You know, China has a position of power on the Human Rights Council, along with many of the more dictatorial countries of the world, who all voted to agree that Canada was guilty of genocide. So, and we have all of our members of parliament who already said that we're guilty of genocide, and they even stood for a moment of silence to remember it. So, you know, what kind of defense can we mount now? So here's a picture of Father Noonan. He doesn't look like a murderous person to me. Looks like the boys are having fun. He's with students of the Kamloops Indian Residential School, and they had a big reunion. Some genocide. How many people have a reunion over a genocide? Not very many. So just to summarize, Indian Residential School facts: education was offered in the treaties. The chiefs and councils requested education, particularly skills training like literacy, agriculture, industry, medical, and clerical. The parents had to register their children to attend, and schooling was not mandatory until 1920, which was in keeping with provincial truancy laws. There are detailed death certificates that were issued if TB, disease, or injury caused a death. If it was an accident at the school, there was an inquest. The Indian agent was involved, the school principal, the Department of Indian Affairs. All these children were very well documented because that's how the school got paid. So the child was either in the school or was back home with the band. And some children were orphans with nowhere else to go, no one to help them. And residential schools served as the regional social services and medical hub in the early days. And we must remember, in 1908, 1 Canadian died every hour of the day, 2 Canadians died every hour of the night from tuberculosis. So Euro-Canadian priests and nuns saved their lives and taught thousands of children how to read and write, and as noted in Xinhua's vision, the Assiniboine chief recalled, our children and grandchildren will be taught the magic art of writing. Just think for a moment what that means. Without the aid of a spoken word, our children will transmit their thoughts on a piece of paper, and that talking paper may be carried to distant parts of the country and convey your thoughts to your friends. Why, even the medicine men of our tribe cannot perform such miracles. But in return for that instruction, Canada is being balkanized by false news, foreign interference, and opportunists. I hope you will learn more. Please support my work. And, O Canada, I stand on guard for thee. And by the way, there are 2 downloadable PDFs of my books. You can either get them on Kindle and pay for them, or you can download the PDF from my website. Yeah. So, thank you.
No, that's good. We've got time for one question, maybe 2. Don't go away. Yeah, we've got 2. Eric and Nicole, come up. Oh, sorry. If it's quick enough, we might get 3. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, Michelle, thanks for that presentation. Awesome. I remember when all this was going down, I was down in southern Alberta. The RCMP office there had the flag at half-mast. And I said, why is it at half-mast? Well, it's a month-long half-mast for this whole lie, right? And it demoralizes people. And I think the UN is a communist environment, and they're tearing down our nation. So why do you think they're doing this? I think it's just to undermine us and to tear us down. It's got nothing to do with Native issues. It's got to do with destroying our country. What do you think? Well,
first of all, if you know the Chinese game of Go, it's a territorial game. So if you have 634 First Nations dotted across the country, and they have many legitimate complaints about treatment over the years, it's a great way to break up a country if you can contact them and create a movement. Canada is probably the luckiest country in the world, filled with resources of every single kind. And we're only 43 million people who don't seem to really care about them very much. We're not doing much to defend against them. We didn't do anything against the tar sands campaign. So it's a cakewalk to come in here and take over in one way or another. That's one way. China has a plan to be the world's manufacturer by 2025, which is just a few months away. For that, they need a lot of critical minerals, and we have almost all of them. And also, China has a plan to be world dominant by 2049. And guess what? We're trying to reach net zero 2050.
Well, I think you've nailed the root of the problem right there. Thanks, Michelle.
Nicole?
Thank you very much, Michelle, for such wonderful research and for writing your documentary. Really appreciate it. I don't have a question as much as comments. I've been in conversation with Leighton Gray, who's quite a wonderful lawyer here in Alberta. And he has said that if it weren't, he's Aboriginal, and if it weren't for his grandmother who went to residential schools, and she has told him this, that he probably would never have gone to university. He's a lawyer now, and he also has a degree in philosophy. And because of going to residential schools, she learned to read and write and learned and appreciated the value of education, which is what she passed on to her children. I also want to make a point about what he said, and perhaps you could please correct it. Although they focus very much on the negative in the report on Truth and Reconciliation, Leighton said that approximately 85% of the report is positive. It's positive comments versus 15% that point to the negatives of residential schools. That many parents, as you say, wanted their children to go to school, and that there weren't schools in the communities, so on the reservations, and they had to send their children to residential schools, for which they were very happy. But they're not focusing at all on the positives. And do you have any idea, like, one, am I correct in this in what I understand? And if so, why is it that there's so much focus on the negatives as opposed to any positive result from the residential schools?
Well, I think the answer was part of what the person before said, that if the country is demoralized, we're not going to fight for our rights, we're not going to question the money paid out. Part of what you say is exactly true. There was a woman hired to meet with all of the adults or descendants of the adults who worked at these schools. She had a $100,000 budget out of, I think it was about a $70 million budget for the TRC. And she was told that her budget was cut to $10,000 and that none of her interviews would be transcribed. So, you know, the thing is, from the TRC, and I believe what the people say, they experienced difficult things. Imagine you're an orphan and you're swept away to this new place, a new language. I mean, for many people, it was very traumatic. And Lloyd Hawkeye Robertson, who's an Indigenous psychologist, he calls it the residential school syndrome, kind of a form of PTSD. Not for everyone, but for some people. So their comments are true, but we never got to hear the adult side of the story. And if you look through the Grey Nun Diaries, you get a completely different story. People having wonderful picnics and working hard and learning things. Anyway.
If you have a question, fine. If you no time for a comment.
No. Quick question. Any thoughts on just the recent document or the announcement, both from the Catholic Church and the chiefs of Kamloops and stuff like that, where the Catholic Church apologized and the chief apologized for misleading Canadians for years about the mass graves, because he knew, or they knew 3 or so days after the first announcement? Are you aware of all that announcement that just was big news over the last couple weeks?
Well, I've seen the news about the Sacred Covenant being posted in Ottawa, but nobody really apologized for fake news as far as I know.
Okay, no, that's brand new in the last week or two, both from the Catholic Church officially and Kamloops chiefs. So,
Okay.
So you have no comment on that yet? Okay.
I'll check into it. Thank you.
Let's give her a warm round of applause for, thank you. What an amazing story. Okay, we've got time. We've got about a 10 or 12 minute break. Just at the break, Vince Byfield is at the back there. Anybody who goes and puts their name in the draw, they're giving away this is the biography of Ted Byfield, if I'm not mistaken. So go and put your name in the draw if you like. It's called The Prairie Lion. Okay, 10 minutes. We're running a little bit tight, but we're going to start again at 3:10. Matea Murta is going to be talking about the war on the family. We just texted her and told her we were going to start at 3:10. So take a break till then. Thank you. You're more than welcome. Thanks for being here.
Over the last few years, many Canadians
Okay, folks, let's get started. Ron Harris, Nadine Wellwood. If you see Maxime Bernier, ask him to sit down. When you see Maxime, ask him to sit down. Okay, let's go, everyone. Let's go, everybody. We're time to roll. In fact, it's past time to roll. Paul Himman. Okay, folks, it gets harder and harder to have, harder and harder to stay on schedule. We've got Mateo online. Yeah, go ahead, yeah, whistle again, one more time. We've got a VP of whistling, that's right. Here we go. There, that helps, yeah. Now we're starting to get the Army's getting involved here. We're gonna have some discipline. We have Mateo online. Nicole, yeah, everybody's got to stop talking. We have Ron Voss. Diane, you have to sit down. Yeah, we're good. We're getting close. I was going to introduce Bill Tufts. Bill Tufts is at the back of the room. Bill Tufts. Okay, no, I'm just talking to. We can try and get Bill Tufts. Bill, wave your hand and then sit down. Yes, okay, there we are. Good, thank you very much. Okay, Matea, have we got Matea online? Can we have a split screen while I introduce her? Hi, Matea. This is one of my favorite people in the whole world. Thank you very much for taking time to be with us. When I was in my cattleman days, her grandfather pilot flew me all over Alberta, and we were in some small little town one night, and we were all having a drink, and the waitress came around, and he was sitting beside me and said, "Would you like something?" And he said, "I'll have a double scotch and bring me 2 of them." And I almost fell off my chair, and then he said, "No, don't bother." But anyway, he had a good sense of humor. I hope you do. Thanks for being a little bit late, Mateo. You're going to talk about, from somewhere in the U.S., you're going to talk about the war on the family. So, Mateo, go ahead. Thank you very much for being here.
Hello, everyone. We're joining back through Zoom, going back to the COVID days. So hopefully everyone can hear me. If I can get a thumbs up from the crowd, that'd be fantastic. Wonderful. Well, thank you, everyone. So glad that you're here today. I was so excited when Danny reached out to me and asked me to talk about the war on the family. It is the #1 issue that I would say that I'm most passionate about. And it is truly my favorite subject to discuss because I have not only seen, but I've studied and researched on the power of the family unit. And coupling with my study, I also worked in various levels of the Canadian government. Danny said, yes, I'm here in the United States, but I also worked as a lead to the Member of Parliament, Brad Trost, a couple of years ago, as well as with a cabinet minister in the province of Saskatchewan. So I am a true Western Canadian through and through. And before I actually was working on the Hill and transitioning into after, I went into a role combating the United Nations. But in each one of these roles, I got to engage in many discussions surrounding policy, but also cultural happenings. And I would often wonder, could there actually be a solution to all the policies that we were creating? Could there be a solution to address the cultural phenomena that's so perverse in today's societies? And this one question brought me to ask probably the most significant of all. What has actually happened to the family? And I would review this issue with regards to specific policies we would seek to address, but realize unless the hearts of homes, which is the hearts of men, changed, these policies would merely serve as a band-aid solution. And simultaneously, I have a deeply personal reason why I so love talking about the family, because the family unit is a solution in any society which it exists. And as a young woman in this generation, which is truly the most feminist of generations, unfortunately, I've borne witness to the devastating impacts of feminism on women, and indeed even more so on the state of men. Now, I like to always tell this one story whenever I'm talking about feminism in general. I was actually at the United Nations a couple years ago talking with some colleagues, and I came across this woman from Planned Parenthood in New York. And her and I started engaging in this very fascinating discussion, and she was heartbroken over her own personal situation because she believed the lie that feminism told her that you can forego having a husband, you can forego creating a home, don't have children, put it off until you're 30, 40, just don't have them at all. And I remember asking her, what's the one thing for the young women in my generation that you wish to talk to us about, or you could tell us? And she said, get married, have children, don't believe the lie. And so this kind of sparked this desire within me to understand feminism down to its very core. Because as soon as she said that, and as soon as I started researching, I started seeing it everywhere in society. Now, the war against the family is a war rooted in feminism. And that is where I would like for us to focus in on for the next couple of minutes that we have together. And as I'm talking, if there's any kind of questions or comments that you would like to discuss at the end, I hope that we have time for a Q&A as well. Now, discussing feminism, it is an ideology, and I would almost classify it almost as its own religion nowadays with third wave feminism. But it has demeaned, it's corrupted, and it's nearly destroyed what it is to be a woman, from our femininity to our standing within society. Meanwhile, it has been having the very same effect on men and their masculinity. Men have been told that they're worthless, that their lives and what they have to contribute to their homes and their families and societies as a whole, that doesn't matter. And this is all thanks to the efforts of feminism. And I like to pull out this quote by British author G.K. Chesterton, because it is something that I like to post every couple months on Twitter, X, and a couple other social media platforms, because it just gets the feminists going, but it also is very revealing. It enlightens people's eyes on the subject, and it's this. Feminism is a muddled idea that when women are free, they are serving their employers, but they become slaves when they help their husbands. For more than a century, women have been sold this idea that getting out into the workforce and paying income tax would be a path to their liberation, their independence, and their freedom. So perhaps we should ask ourselves, who has benefited the most from this fundamental restructuring of society? The government, that's who. Men, women, and children lose out the harshest. So-called women's liberation was one phase of the feminist psyop designed to get women out of the home so they could be exploited by governments as mere taxpayers. And someone that I have obviously had to research in this subject of feminism is Karl Marx, who wrote in his Communist Manifesto, which a book, I believe, in my opinion, should actually be mandatory reading for all high schoolers, as it reveals this brutal reality of how Marxist policies seek to destroy societies by targeting the family. But that is clearly for another day. It has been said that the first building block of a dynasty is the self-sufficient home. And this truth applies to any point in time and in any place on the globe, seeing as families exist in every nation. And yet, at present, they are the most underappreciated, and here in the West, I would even argue the most discriminated against entity. This is not a new war, however. It's been ongoing for decades. At some moments, it's been a little bit more predominant, and others more minute. Nonetheless, there's an agenda to take down the family as we know it, and that can be clearly seen through education, through entertainment, the financial system, government policies, all the way down to advertising, small things. And there is this compounding effect within society where from every single front, there seems to be this anti-family messaging being shoved down our throats. Now, I remember being, again, back at the United Nations, walking the streets of New York, and I came across this stand. And I love, love, love reading magazines, research articles, anything having to do with the family. And there was Parenting Magazine, and I just read it, and I was like, this is kind of fascinating. And I looked on, and they had like 3 or 4 different issues of that magazine. And I realized that on the front cover, there were only women. There were no men. There was no husband and wife and a child. There were just women holding children. And I realized that feminism has led us all the way to the point of we actually exclude men from the total equation of the family. and we say that they're not valuable. Advertising, messaging is incredibly important. And suddenly, upon reading this magazine, I realized that the war on the family was being waged against individual components of the family, and this was the best way to take it down. The battles have been against masculinity, femininity, faith, traditionalism, and most significantly amongst all those things is Christianity as a whole, which has created these societies which we live in, which have helped many nations, not just those where it exists, to flourish, as well as the families within them. Now, speaking to the issue of femininity and tradition specifically, there is a desperate need for the traditional roles which women once filled to be resurrected. And in their resurrection, there is a deep need for those roles to once again be praised in societies. And not just for the sake of the family itself, but for the whole of our nations. Women were once praised for the crucial roles they had and have in creating independence and freedom from the corrupt state for the family. Sufficiency is key to defending a nation's families from its government, and women have always played a critical role in creating homes that are efficient as well as self-sufficient. Women have held the crucial positions of wives and mothers, community organizers, good Samaritans, teachers, homemakers, anything and everything having to do with serving the poor, nurses, and that list could go on and on. And these positions were praised long before feminism was even a glimmer in the suffragettes' eye. Women held these important positions, not because they had been forced to be there, but because our natural skill sets and personalities drew us to these areas of expertise. The roles held by women in the pre-feminism world were indeed valued and seen as essential, honorable, and praiseworthy. In the last century, the powerful impact women have had on this essential aspect of Western culture has been neutered in the process of making us mere producers and consumers. Those once essential, honorable, and praiseworthy positions and roles have been tarnished as backwards and degrading and even underachieving. So, thanks a lot, feminism. But this isn't to say there were no women-specific issues that caused life to be challenging in the past. Of course, the past was a brutal place for all of humanity, not just men and not just women. However, throughout the course of time, despite any disparity women and men have faced, women and men have always found empowerment through the work they do, both inside and outside the home. And this work wasn't just praised, but valued. And I would repeat that over and over again, because this is the place we need to get our societies back to. And that starts with you and I upholding these traditional roles we as men and women have. Now, as I briefly touched on before, Karl Marx is someone that I have done a deep dive into, and I really do desire for the rest of my generation to understand the Marxist ideology and its roots and its connection to feminism. Marxism stems from socialism. This is just basics. Everybody here knows that. I know we're at this major freedom conference today, but we need to say this for the sake of anyone who does know. Socialism, with its original focus on workers' rights, concentrated on the conflict between oppressor and the oppressed, as it pertained to the upper and lower economic classes in society. Feminism uses the exact same dichotomy. But instead of oppressor and oppressed being seen from the economic standpoint, it's seen from the perspective of gender. And please note my use of the word gender. I use this word as synonymous with sex because it has not changed in the world, regardless of what woke individuals like Justin Trudeau or individuals at the UN or anyone else has to say in media. Sex and gender are the same. Now, both Marxism and feminism are ideological perspectives pertaining to power in a society. Who has it and its rightful distribution. The haves and the have-nots became the masculine and the feminine. Both ideologies set out to obtain the same outcome of, if we're being honest, absolute misery, by distorting and equalizing the differences between the economic classes as well as our natural human differences, which were instilled in us by God. Marxists and feminists each claim that the natural order is fundamentally flawed, thus saying that which God, a perfect God, designed is also flawed, which is an absolute impossibility. They also say that in lifting up the weak and keeping the strong in check, all persons can experience freedom. And this is completely and utterly a deceptive lie, as the opposite is so obviously the truth. But in a culture where absolute truths are no longer acknowledged and truth is now relative, what more can we really expect? One of the more so predominant lies that women were sold in the acceptance of feminism is that if not for men, we would have no power. Therefore, women were told they needed to wage a war against men in order to take our freedom and power. This has led to some very devastating results for women. Both sexes, in and of themselves, possess a power that the other doesn't inherently have. And these powers are subdued and even diminished if used against the other, as they are meant to be used in a union with one another. Male and female are complementary, not anti the other as feminism portrays them to be. Saying women are powerless because men have all the power is proof that feminists have no understanding of the power he has. And they also diminish the immense power masculinity has. And we need both in every society. Because no civilization could function without that which lies at the core of masculinity and femininity. With femininity, there's creativity and nurturing, the ability to produce life, there's softness and beauty in the world, and that list could go on and on. No civilization could also function with that which lay at the core of masculinity: leadership, protection, direction, strength, provision, and that list could go on ad nauseum as well. The power that men and women both possess are not interchangeable, nor should we desire them to be. Vladimir Lenin was intentional and vocal about his goal to destroy the traditional family. And how was he going to do it? By forcing women into the workforce and out of their homes, and in doing so, forcing the nation's children into government schools, where they would be taught the dictates of the state over the morals and values that they would have been taught in their homes by their mothers and fathers. And just as with feminism, Lenin believed that a woman in the home was a waste of a worker who could be giving of her time and efforts to the state over the welfare of her husband, her children, and her community. This gave rise to the equal pay for equal work slogan we see plastered on signs and chanted throughout the streets during feminist rallies. It is quite disgusting to see. And the Bolshevik government legislated equal work for equal pay, something that I have commonly heard throughout my time in the Canadian government and in working with politicians here in the US. But I often wonder, do these modern day feminists know or even care that they're using a slogan of such a deadly regime? I highly doubt it, and honestly, I don't think they would care, seeing as they were raised in these government schools where this Marxist ideology seems to not only have creeped into the classroom, but be proudly taught as gospel today. In all of this discussion about the war on the family, the reason why I came to the conclusion of, why are governments even promoting this? Don't they seek to help the family? And I was quite naive at the time of me being in government and asking that question. But I came to the understanding that in promoting feminism, the state was actually seeking to expand its power over society, using policy, not only to affect the short term, but the long term as well. And this is mostly why feminism is so proudly paraded by politicians, as it increases the workforce whilst lowering employers' wages and doubles government's taxation. Also, womenless homes means the raising of children is outsourced to government schools and daycares where, again, the ethos of the state takes precedent over any religion or creed. Essentially, this creates a factory line of workers. as we saw back with quotes with Rockefeller here in the United States, and the creation of the, I hate to say public schools, I like to demean them even more and call them government schools, because that's really what they are. They sought to pre-program individuals to fall in line with the state's desires from kindergarten through graduation and all the way through now this really sad state of needing to go on to further education, which is further programming. Their time and money, women's time and money, is used for the state over the family, as now women are told this is the norm. And it's unquestionable to bring up the fact that this isn't a norm in societies. It hasn't been a norm in societies. And as a debacle, as a result of this debacle, women have ultimately become more reliant on the state. And as a whole, the family has. By making men the scapegoat for the historical and modern issues women face, elites and social engineers of the day conveniently get overlooked in their role in keeping both men and women down, not to mention what they have gained from this movement. What's bad for the family home is great for the economy from a taxation point of view. But that's merely a short-term view. In the long term, this devastates everyone. And I wanted to give you a couple examples of what we are facing in this fight for the family and this fight against the family. As I said, I go to the United Nations, and I wanted to tell you a little bit about what we are facing on that front, because it's so perverse and yet it's so sneaky at the same time. From this internationally agreed upon definition of the family, which at current state stands as one man and one woman who are married, the UN, along with all the governments that fund it, because we aren't just talking about the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, we're not just talking about George Soros and Open Society, we're talking about the bulk of the funding that flows into the UN, which comes for our governments, majority of which comes from Canada, United States now under the Biden administration, as well as European nations. So this definition of marriage, of family, of one man, one woman, they're seeking to distort it and turn it into a community-based arrangement. And this is the direction that globalist institutions, which are in operation through our tax dollars, are pushing for. Who does that serve? That doesn't serve the family. That doesn't serve anyone in a society except the Marxists, which seek to prop up this definition. And this harms children ultimately. Yet another example is out of Massachusetts, where House Bill 4750 would remove the word father on a birth certificate in the name of legal parentage equality. And this new law would replace the terms man and woman with persons, and replace mother with person who gave birth. And this bill has already passed the House and is currently being weighed in the Senate. We see this also all throughout society, again, with the messaging through children's programming, the attack on femininity and masculinity, as we've already discussed, the attack on children's innocence, because they are also in the family unit. And I can't even discuss everything that we talk about at the United Nations, but one of the main issues that I focus in on is education. The perversion of education, really. Out in, I guess we're the freedom-loving crowd here, so I can speak freely. Out in Europe, the European standard for child sexual education, they tell children, infants, 0 to 4 years old, that they should know and learn how to masturbate. This is what children are being taught. And it's devastating to my heart. But as we see, every single element of the family unit has a target placed upon it, and very intentionally so. Because each and every element brings power to the whole dynamic of the family. And these attacks are intentional. And so we must also be intentional in our homes, intentional in our personal lives and professional lives, intentional how we spend our time with our families and spouses and in our communities. Now, I know this has been a lot of maybe more so leaning on the negative side of the war, But a point of more so of the incredible news that I would be remiss not to share is that of what is happening with the next generation. I myself am a millennial, on the tail end of a millennial, but I wanted to kind of do a little bit of research into what's happening with Gen Z, Gen Alpha, all these other generations to come. And there's this shift more towards tradition. There is this desire for marriage, a return to faith, as well as this beautiful pushback that young people are having as they're rising against this agenda to dismantle that which we all hold dear, and that's the family. Actually, out in Ontario, just last month during Pride Month, I saw a couple of students, a couple of classrooms actually get out of their seats and walk out of their schools and protest against the LGBT flag. Because these young people are being taught in their homes, yes, slap, absolutely. But this is coming, it reminds me of that scripture out of the Bible, out of the mouth of babes. These children are taking their position of authority because they understand the agenda, maybe not in totality, but they know there's something wrong with it and they're taking a stand. That's who the next generation is. Gen Alpha has consistently, throughout data, proven to have these deep and beautiful desires for family, for marriage, for community, for faith. However, as a young person who deeply relied upon those older than her to give her wisdom and instruction and to guide me, even with these same desires that I have, and recognize in the next generation, we need guidance and direction from the generations who have come before us. They need us. They need you and they need me to share the wisdom of the lives we've lived in order to steer themselves in a direction that we have not yet to be. So for however long as humanity exists, there is a reason to fight for the family. There's a reason to take a stand. There's a reason to show up at marches and to write articles and to talk with your children and your grandchildren at the dinner table. There is a reason behind all these things. There's a reason, and we are not helpless. We actually hold the power. We can see all the negative things politicians say about those who uphold and value the family. We hear what the media has to say. But thank God, we know we can recognize who the enemy actually is. And therefore, we must be intentional in our fight against our adversary. And if there is just one thing out of this entire speech that I hope you remember, let it be this. Whatever there is a target on, there is immense value in. And if there's going to be a war, let it be waged by us against those who seek to destroy that which we hold dear. And that's the family. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Matea. As usual, you've inspired our whole group, and I think you could hear the applause, or do you get to hear that at your end?
I can't hear it, but I can definitely see it, sir.
Okay,
Thank
good.
you.
Okay, good enough. Okay. Do we have a question? Somebody want to ask a question? Eric, your turn. Yeah. We've got somebody coming to the mic. Thank you very much. That's a great message. Go ahead, Eric.
It sure was a great message, Matea. Thank you. So much to pick up on what you said. I remember 25 years ago, I was the family caucus guy for the Reform Party, and I remember the UN had launched a program to teach kids about democracy, and they passed every government, they passed every school board, and when you looked at the program, it was giving children rights over their parents, teaching that in the classroom, and it was a UN program. Mm-hmm. So the UN really has had an agenda for a while. Two things. How dark is the UN? I think they're communists. I think they're totally sold out, and Canada leads the charge there, but I'd like to hear what you think. And then the second point would be the agenda, and how much of this is spiritual? Like, are we fighting a spiritual battle, or are we fighting a sort of a let's just fix the politics battle? And I have my own opinions, but you've been in the front line, so I'd like to hear what you say.
Wow. Well, thank you, sir, for serving our country and our communities in your positions. That's incredible. I know that there's a lot of work that goes into that, a lot of spiritual work that also goes into that. I'll start with the former question and then go on to the latter. The UN is very dark. It is very, very dark. I won't dismiss that. I won't belittle that. There is a very spiritual component to being within the UN, and it is very intense, very much so. I remember the first time I actually went on to the UN campus in New York City, and take it or leave it for whatever you may think of this, but I do remember being faced with this immense darkness, and it was inexplainable. There's been several attacks that the UN has launched, and yes, one of the issues with regards to that education curriculum that you brought forward, that fed into the Convention on the Rights of the Child, or the CRC, and that's the most ratified UN document in history. Thankfully, the United States is the only country to this point who has not signed on to that document, but it's very pervasive, very intensive, and it points to this disgust with parents, with mothers and fathers, husbands and wives, and the significant role that they play in a child's life. So is the UN very dark? Incredibly so. Not just on the front of attacking the family also, whether it comes to financial matters, whether it comes to reordering, the totality of societies, of the global structure. They do want a one world government. That's not a surprise, I don't think, to anybody in this room. They want to control societies. And for some reason or another, our countries hand over our tax dollars in the billions in order to see those agendas move forward. And just so everybody in this room knows, at the United Nations, there's voluntary and involuntary funding, and our governments get to choose what they fund at the United Nations. So they are intentionally funding these agendas, and they have a choice in it all. Now, to again touch on the spiritual aspect of the fight, everything I see in life is spiritual. Everything in life. And as such, we've been given the very tools, we've been equipped through the Word of God in order to how to do this war well. And it's not a fight against policies or politicians. It's not a fight against civil society or curriculums. Those are just symptoms of the disease. What we're fighting is our adversary, true adversary. And he uses people, plain and simple. And so I also know that as a Christian, I get to fight this fight from a place of victory already. So I'm disturbed by these things, but I'm not, it doesn't sway me in any which direction. I have a clear pointer ahead of me, and I go on and I fight. And the more people who are empowered by the Spirit of God and move forward in that direction, the better, because that's where the power is. It's not in having a microphone. It's not in having a title or a position. It's in being filled with the Spirit of God and moving forward. So thank you for those questions. Those were wonderful.
Thank you, Mateo. Am I on the, go ahead, Doug, come up to the microphone, but I'll just, can you put me on the split screen for a second? I'm just holding, we've got a crusty old retired soldier here who's, he's thinking just like you. He's selling the book, it's Who Was Karl Marx? So we're certainly well aware of like who our enemies are, and we're all agreed on that. So, but anyway, thank you, and thank you. Tex, it's you that's selling, but isn't, yeah, Tex has got some books over there, Who Was Karl Marx? You're right, everybody should read it. It might be not quite as good as the Communist Manifesto, but it would be a good start. But Doug, go ahead.
Yeah, well, great talk, first of all. Really good.
Thank you, sir.
As I look across history, I can't see, a successful revolution, social or otherwise, that did not have at its core the support and active participation of women. So I think it's great to see young people like you take this cause up. Now, aside from the voluntary funding, what practical steps could we have to try and get away from this evil United Nations?
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your service. I'm very grateful for that. I don't take that lightly. Practical steps. in terms of fighting the UN, in terms of fighting the voluntary funding towards different streams within the UN? Very interesting question. And this is one thing that I love to touch on often. And that is how we, as citizens of any nation, to be honest, can actually go to first our members of parliament, because it's federal funding, it's not state or provincial, it is federal funding. So go to your member of parliament and first look up, do your own research, find what are and aren't voluntary funding streams into the UN, and then show them, show your member of parliament, hey, this is what our money is going towards. And I'll say this also, as someone who worked in a member of parliament's office, whether you like the MP, whether they're part of your party or not, you need to have a position in their life. You need to show up at their offices. You need to have those personal communications politely, respectfully, but we need to be that force. So do your own research, present it to those members of parliament, ask them, why are we spending money on this? And then, and you can actually, just as you would lobby a member of parliament, you can actually lobby your representatives to the United Nations. And so if you want to do that, quite simply, you would look up Canada's mission to the United Nations, and you would start communicating with them, send them emails, make phone calls, again, respectfully and politely, but this is one way that nobody outside of, you know, Planned Parenthood, for example, really actually gets things done. So if citizens actually started doing this and getting activated in this way, this would be an incredible step forward to ensuring that, one, our voices are heard, but two, getting down to the funding aspect of it and talking with the politicians themselves. Because we could talk to bureaucrats all we want, they're going to do whatever the government tells them to do. But as soon as you have that point, that personal point of contact with a member of parliament, then game over. They have to give you a response and take nothing less than a full comprehensive response from them, because that's what is due to you.
We have one more question, and I think that'll be about the end of it. And just, Mateo, just before I take the one question, like tomorrow we have Alex Newman. I assume you know, do you know Alex Newman? Maybe, yes, you do,
I do.
of course. Yeah, he's speaking tomorrow, and I'll send you a link if you'd like to listen to what he has to say tomorrow. But anyway, we have and he's going to he's talking about the war on the family as well. So go ahead. Or actually, he's talking about protecting our children, which is much the same war. Go ahead.
Well, thanks very much again for your talk. It's really great, and I think we need more young ladies like you kind of getting that across, because coming from Gen X, you know, that was really embedded in us females. Like, you know, we've got to fight the man, and, you know, you know, it really did. It was like an internal war even for myself. I wasn't, until I really hit my 40s, I really didn't realize, you know, how that impacted my own life, my own family life with my own children. And, you know, now I'm a grandma just as of 3 weeks ago, so that's great. But anyway, my question is do you think that now, like at a provincial level, let's say, because, you know, you have a little bit of background in that political realm, that we're able to actually change the parental laws provincially? Like, do we have that ability, you know, if we could get a politician to put forward a policy? Because right now, parental rights are based on guardianship, right? It doesn't matter if you've birthed your children or whatever. If the government decides that you've done something wrong, they can take your children away and they can take your rights away. So really, we don't have parental rights. Is that something that can be legislatively changed by a province?
Wonderful question. I love this question. It's something that I was rolling around or playing with in my mind when I was on the Hill and then went into the provincial level. I do believe it is possible. Indeed, you would just need to ensure that whoever is putting it forward and structuring it, that they really are for the sake of the family, and that there's, I would say, get civil society involved. You want not just civil society, you have to have parents involved, but a parental bill of rights on any front. It could be tailored in such a way that would be very beneficial for parents. I do get a little weary, really, of having positions in governments, a cabinet position and anything the like, where it's for the family. And that might just be my own ick around that, because I know that if we as pro-family individuals were to run with it, it would be used for good. But we also have to think like our enemy and really understand that that could also be taken in very perverse directions. But if you have a set fundamental Bill of Rights for the sake of parents that is structured well, it's very, very doable. I would also say it's something that could actually go cross aisle depending on which province you're in. So it could be a bridging of the gap between the political divide and something that every single political party, or I mean, minus maybe the NDP, would sign on to for the most part. But it is something that could be quite unifying as long as there is good voices involved, and as long as there is a really, really strong effort on the local front. And I say local front, which I mean parents, individuals. I'm not yet married, I don't have children yet, but I go and advocate for these positions as a single woman who desires to have these things one day in life. And so if there's an effort to a campaign really to inform politicians that this is a bill going to come forward, but it's by the people, it's by the citizens, that's where the impact is going to be, and that's where a bill could actually be produced and be successful. Great question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear you can hear the applause there, Mateo? When one of the things that we're hoping to do at the end of the conference is sort of get a group of people at all different levels, and Tanya Gaw is going to be talking tomorrow about all the different people they have working at all the different levels, and it's certainly one of the things we'll have to work on is like this Parents' Bill of Rights or whatever. And as we go forward, we'll try and keep in touch with you so we can learn from your wisdom, and you can help us, and we'll go from there. So thank you very much. I guess that's the end of your presentation. Like I say, we'll send you a link if you happen to want to watch tomorrow, but we'll do that. But thank you very much for being with us. We'll look forward to seeing you again, okay?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the conference.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think we're pretty much right on schedule. We're just right on schedule, 8 minutes behind schedule. But is Brian Lee Crowley? He's going to be just calling him up sometime soon. Brian's going to talk to us about why we admire China, which will be I didn't know we did, but I guess some people do. Isn't that the truth? Yeah, exactly. This is one more reason why we want to get him out of Ottawa. That's exactly right. We're just waiting to connect. Okay, great. John, do you happen to want to come up and say a few nice words about Brian Lee Crowley? I think you know him better than I, or if you like to, or sure. I think. Were you a colleague of his, or you just know him from your different travels? Nice, put you on the spot. Go ahead.
All right, here we are. All right, well, I don't know if Brian is here to overhear any remarks I may happen to make about him, but yes, I was, it's working? I was actually the managing editor when Brian set up the Macdonald-Laurier Institute in Ottawa. And if you don't know about Brian, he actually was a tenured academic who decided that that was far too risky a way to live, so he chucked it in and formed a free market think tank in Atlantic Canada. A far more stable career prospect and a sign of his extreme realism. And then he decided that it was a very strange thing about Canada that we did not have a full-service think tank in the nation's capital. And so he founded the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, whose name can tell you right off the extent to which he respects and tries to preserve and enhance Canada's tradition, including two prime ministers who may often be underestimated, but both of whom were in fact devotees of limited government. Laurier, among other things, said Canada is free and freedom is its nationality. And if we were more able to remember that he is the first giant in the Liberal Party of Canada after Confederation. Those words should, I think, echo much more than they do. Have we got him? Okay, well, I won't take any more of his time other than to say that Brian is one of those, it's rather rare in the policy debate that he is a very committed, I would say, libertarian on policy, and he can contradict me if he does not agree with that description, but he's also very good on national security, and that is a rare and precious combination. So I won't take any more of his time. Brian, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Hearing me well, and you can see me. I'm going to assume if I don't hear to the contrary that you are. So really want to
Brian,
thank you.
Brian, excuse
Yes.
me for a minute. We're just waiting to rotate the screen. Right at the moment, you're laying on your side. So I don't know who has to.
Oh.
Who has to do that? Anybody?
I was hoping to have a brief nap here.
You actually look like you. Yeah, if we could send you a pillow if we had time. But is there anything we can do about this, David? Not that we couldn't hear you. Oh, there. You're just rotating in our screen. Yeah, the eagle has landed. We're all good. Okay. Well,
Okay.
Welcome to Red Deer, Brian. Okay, we're ready to go now.
Okay, let me just adjust my camera a little bit since changed the orientation. Great, I can see you all very well. And again, thank you for the invitation to be here. So there's two main threads that I wanted to pursue in my talk today. One looks at China and its political and economic model and asks whether it is one worthy of the admiration of Canadians, as it has already won the admiration of our Prime Minister. And the second thread is the extent to which China and other authoritarian powers, such as Iran and Russia, are using the openness of Canadian society as a weapon against us, and the measures that we can take to protect ourselves. So let me start with the Prime Minister and his views of China. While still in opposition, Prime Minister Trudeau raised a few eyebrows. He certainly raised my eyebrows when he expressed, quote, admiration for how China's, quote, basic dictatorship is actually allowing them to turn their economy around on a dime. Now, in my view, these comments reveal two things about the Prime Minister's worldview that should have been deeply disquieting. And we might have all saved ourselves a lot of trouble if we had grasped what he meant back when he was just an opposition politician. First, this is a man who worships power. He believes that all that stands between us and a perfect world is ignorant and selfish forces who inexplicably obstruct those progressives striving to shed the vicious past and take us to the promised land of fairness and plenty for all. And the way to overcome these obstructions is untrammeled power, an ability to sweep aside the ignorant and the self-interested. As with Plato's guardians, that power should be vested in a ruling class that actually runs things like the economy after having sought the advice of the best and the brightest experts. Trifles like democracy are a cumbersome and unwelcome obstacle to this enlightened expertise. I would venture to say that for the Prime Minister, the COVID-19 pandemic perfectly illustrates and vindicates progressives' ambition to remake our society, to turn away from fossil fuels, to launch a green recovery, to wrestle prejudice to the ground, possibly to create a permanent guaranteed annual income, or to fix our access to drugs or daycare. In short, to transform Canadian society. And I would make the case that in the Prime Minister's mind, this is the Chinese model. So I think it's not far-fetched to use the pandemic as an object lesson in why untrammeled power, guided by supposedly enlightened expert opinion, is not some better system, but is remarkably inferior to the one that we already have. If anything, the pandemic and government's response gives far more comfort to those who are skeptical and humble about what governments can actually achieve for us than it does to the adherents of the progressive creed. The pandemic didn't reveal an all-wise governing class whose superior knowledge entitled them to fix Canada. Rather, COVID underlined the limits of technocratic expertise, the ignorance of governments, and the fragility of social solidarity founded on a passing crisis. Did technocratic expertise save us during the corona outbreak? It is not anti-science to observe that there were lots of experts peddling their expertise everywhere. But it soon became evident that equally credible experts were often offering diametrically opposed advice. Some experts' advice was followed in some places, and it worked out okay. Elsewhere, different experts' advice was followed with less impressive results. Some countries did well at specific points of the outbreak, others not so well at different points. Policymakers were most emphatically not acquiescing in some widespread expert consensus. Mostly policymakers listened to people who happened to be at hand and sounded plausible. In the event, their advice was sometimes correct, sometimes not, and sometimes simply neutral, neither helpful nor harmful. The reality is, we won't know for some time, if ever, what the right response would have been. There are likely to be many different expert-approved responses that turn out to be defensible, each characterized by a unique mix of strengths and weaknesses. When the next pandemic strikes, COVID's lessons will be trotted out by the experts when the specific characteristics of COVID-19 may be more or less relevant. Our knowledge will again be partial and imperfect. Generals always fight the last war because that's where their expertise lies. COVID didn't prove that powerful governments, guided by dispassionate experts and science, gives us the right answers. Our own experts change their minds repeatedly. Just think about masks and home testing kits. They contradicted each other. They adjusted course as new knowledge became available. And that last point is key. The default condition of humanity isn't knowledge, but ignorance. No one, least of all government, has a godlike overview of all the knowledge, even about something as clear and immediate as COVID. Yet the progressives' vaulting ambition rests squarely on claims to be able to fix our ills through the application of expert knowledge administered by bureaucrats under the leadership of wise politicians. In fact, these knowledge claims are a complete fiction designed to make attractive a program of using political power to impose progressive designer prejudices on the rest of us. Consider that the latest estimate is that the entire stock of human knowledge may be doubling every 24 hours. And that's a huge acceleration from the more traditional assumption, which was that knowledge, the entire body of human knowledge, doubled about every 10 or 15 years. And even at that old rate, everything that you learned at school and at university would be completely obsolete by the end of your working career. So think about how many transformative knowledge breakthroughs happen not through design, not by the direction of experts, but by accident. Things like the discovery of penicillin and the telescope and steel making. And in addition to all these things, ponder how much of what we know is tacit, things we know how to do, but struggle to explain to others how to do. Just think about great hockey players that end up being zeros as coaches because they know how to play hockey, but they don't know how to explain it. Comprehensive knowledge on which the progressives base their claim to govern is a dangerous pipe dream, a mere pretense of knowledge. Public health experts and epidemiologists and microbiologists cannot also be experts on the 1,000 other areas of expertise on which a robust response to a pandemic relies. How to make testing kits, how to manufacture vaccines, how to supply personal protective equipment, how to design tracking apps, run logistics chains, or the 1,000 other things that are or may be needed. No single laboratory, no matter how many experts they employed, was given the job of isolating the virus, of analyzing it, of discovering the best way to test for it, of developing a vaccine, or testing all the existing pharmaceutical products against the virus to see if any of them work. Instead, resources intended to hasten the discovery of COVID-related knowledge were handed to many public and private labs around the world, who then produced a plethora of experimental solutions and relied on a steady stream of independent discoveries from other scientists. Researchers were, in effect, competing with each other to find the most effective medicines, vaccines, or testing kits. And all of these things, this whole panoply of competitive efforts, was necessary because of the partial state of our knowledge and because the much vaunted expertise of those advising governments is impotent outside their extremely narrow area of knowledge and is of limited use even there. In every field, including pandemics, the thing is that there is no single right answer as to what to do. Instead, there are competing answers, and all of them are permanently subject to revision as we learn more about ourselves, about society, about the economy, and about the physical world. Different answers will suit different people better according to their character, their circumstances, and their desires. Technical experts can give us a rather dated view about how to do what we want, but expertise has nothing to say about what we should want. Yet progressives are always putting about the idea that if you knew what they knew, you would set aside your attachment to your petty desires and aims in life. Their superior knowledge licenses them to fix the economy, fix our response to climate change, fix our social programs, fix when and how we live, fix the distribution of jobs and incomes, fix the varying statuses amongst arbitrary identity groups, and much more beside. When we allow experts to impose their narrow understanding on the rest of us through political power, closing off the ceaseless experimentation, which is the only real source of knowledge, we don't become collectively smarter and better informed. We become collectively stupider because we are only acting then on the limited knowledge of the people at the top, not the knowledge possessed by society as a whole, knowledge which is complex, widely distributed, and unknowable in its entirety by anybody. So the patchwork so horrifies progressives, in which different people get different things in different combinations from different suppliers, isn't a poor second best, but demonstrably superior to public officials telling us what we were entitled to based on whatever fashionable expert opinion gives them a pretext to impose. We have slowly and incrementally evolved a society that is the envy of the world. Canada is not a problem to be fixed, but a rich inheritance to be enjoyed and cautiously, incrementally adjusted to embrace new ideas and experiences. Our society is far more likely to be harmed than improved by a handful of ignorant politicians and bureaucrats thinking they know more about Canada than the generations of Canadians who have built the successful institutions and practices that each generation has handed off enriched to its successor. And what about the alleged social solidarity engendered by the COVID crisis? I know that the hope of the Prime Minister was that it could be used to resolve a host of other issues that seemed insoluble before. And he was thinking here, I'm sure, about the experience of Britain after the end of the Second World War. 6 years of rationing, shortages, and helping each other out inspired the Labour Party to promise to run peacetime society along wartime lines. And their slogan in the 1945 general election, some of you may know, was, "And now win the peace." War and peace, however, are not the same thing. In the war, victory was all. When peace arrived, however, people mostly craved a return to normality. They made their own decisions about what mattered to them. Social solidarity was seen as license for bureaucrats to order people around in accordance with other people's ideas, mostly the ideas of the experts who were going to fix society's problems. It took only a year or two for the spirit of Dunkirk to become an increasingly irksome rallying cry, and the response to COVID has proved just as evanescent. Progressives love the idea that everyone else will drop their stubborn attachment to their selfish priorities and sacrifice their narrow vision for the common good. But what they usually have in mind is that the rest of us should give up what we want and pursue what they want instead. In the future, this will be the great fault line separating Canadians politically. On the one hand, will be those who believe politicians should harness experts to fix Canada, according to principles that appeal to progressives. On the other hand, will be those who believe that such claims to superior insight into Canada and Canadians are in fact simply thinly disguised power grabs to impose progressive prejudices on people who have other plans for how to live their lives. Politicians are in no position to second guess either the institutions and behaviors that Canadians hold in great affection, or the things that each of us have decided matter to us, to our families, and to our communities. Canada was not imposed from the top down, but built from the bottom up. It does not belong to the government. It belongs to Canadians. And that is why I do not admire China's basic dictatorship and think the idea that they can, quote, turn their economy on a dime is an ignorant, fanciful, and destructive pipe dream. Unfortunately, it is one firmly anchored in the mind of our Prime Minister. And that brings me to the second thread in my talk today, which, as you will remember, is how China and other authoritarians are using the openness and trusting nature of Canadians and our institutions as a weapon to be used against us, aided and abetted by our deeply compromised political class. Chinese election interference is, of course, a hot topic in Canada today, yet while it is indeed a matter of enormous importance, it is one that must be placed in the context of the new Cold War against the West. This Cold War is one in which Russia and China have long been engaged, while here at home the left has continuously warned us against adopting an outdated Cold War mentality. The only ones who are out of date, however, are those whose understanding of recent history ends with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the beginning of the so-called end of history, in which the values of liberal democracy and the West reign undisputed forever and ever. Amen. History, however, never stops, but is, in Henry Ford's immortal phrase, just one damn thing after another. Now we are called on to respond to the one damn thing after another which has been happening in the minds and actions of the West's adversaries in recent decades. Let me open a brief historical parenthesis and remind everyone that Cold War Mark I between the USSR and the West started in Ottawa. In September 1945, a whistleblower at the Russian embassy, Igor Guzenko, stole documents detailing Soviet espionage against the West. And when the extent of Soviet perfidy was revealed, Canada enthusiastically joined other Western democracies in creating the post-war collective security architecture that we know, including NATO. But revealingly, Gouzenko wandered Ottawa for a day, desperately trying to get anyone to take an interest in his tale of betrayal and duplicity. Why would those nice Russians, our allies in the Second World War, led by the dynamic Uncle Joe Stalin, want to harm us nice, inoffensive Canadians? The answer then, as now, is power-hungry despots who despise our way of life. Cold War Mark II, between an aggressively imperialist China and a revanchist Russia on one hand, and a naive and credulous West, did not begin in Canada this time. Its tentacles, however, reach deeply into Canadian society, endangering our citizens, our economy, and our interests. Russia's bloody invasion of Ukraine, like China's kidnapping of the two Michaels, and recent revelations about Beijing's suborning of many of our institutions, including the very machinery of our democracy, has shone a bright light on this conflict. And it is vital that we now harness this attention to concentrate the minds of Canadians. What cannot be allowed to happen is what almost happened to Igor Gouzenko, namely meeting a wall of incomprehension and indifference, leaving Canadians to relapse into their dogmatic slumbers, certain that no one harbors any ill will towards us nice Canadians. You see, authoritarians learned long ago that people in the West will generally resist bold military threats to their domestic freedoms and democracy. It's true that the West often did the right thing only after, as Churchill once said of the Americans, having exhausted all the other options. Putin certainly miscalculated the West's moral resolve in the face of the invasion of Ukraine, causing Russia immense pain and humiliation, perhaps making Xi Jinping reevaluate his plan to welcome by force of arms Taiwan back into the embrace of the Chinese Communist Party. The world's bullies have now understandably shifted to working tirelessly to weaken the West's moral resolve. Misinformation and disinformation about us, delivered to our television, our social media feeds, and our inboxes by armies of internet trolls, are thus today's front line in the struggle to defend freedom and democracy. Authoritarians use the social media megaphone to repeat that the West and democracy are vicious, corrupt, and indefensible. Our adversaries stoke conflict within our societies and sap our will to defend our values and our way of life. If our societies are nothing but vile repositories for all that is worst about human society, racism, sexism, white supremacy, homophobia, societies built on the legacy of slavery and colonial exploitation, then we are not worth defending, are we? And as for our friends, well, Russia also spreads misinformation about Ukraine, for example. Russian-inspired online narratives about alleged Nazification in a country governed by a democratically elected Jewish president, no less. And persecution of ethnic Russians are then repeated by trusting but naive Canadians, usually accompanied by a "both sides are so nasty we shouldn't get involved" gloss. Our adversaries understand perfectly that Western military superiority over the world's authoritarians is meaningless if we lack the political and moral resolve to use it. If we think there truly is no moral difference between free democracies and authoritarian despotisms. That's why China and Russia take aim at our culture, our beliefs, and our institutions. Their object is nothing less than to cause us to lose faith in ourselves and the society that we have built. Disinformation is clearly present, for example, in Canadian pipeline debates, as Russia seeks to hobble a competitor in supplying oil and gas to Western countries. Moscow has weaponized the resulting deep energy dependence in Europe. Foreign information, misinformation was clearly a factor in numerous other elections, referendum campaigns, think Brexit, and social movements, such as green opposition to various industries, or the narrative about our very own freedom convoy. These misinformation narratives have been spread throughout the West in recent years. Foreign policy isn't out there, it is here, affecting our lives and our social harmony every day. There are other ways in which our adversaries are using our own strengths against us. In the trade sphere, for example, we assume that other countries sign trade deals in the same spirit of trade openness as we do. There can be no doubt, however, that China has used industrial espionage and trade agreements for the explicit purpose of achieving industrial and economic domination over the West, destroying Canadian industrial giants like Nortel along the way. The result has been the deindustrialization of our societies. In Canada's case, we have aided and abetted our adversaries' ambitions by allowing them to launder and then invest money on an industrial scale. A good deal of that money, by the way, comes from selling deadly fentanyl to Canadians because, as some of you may know, China, using Mexican intermediaries, is by far the largest supplier of the opioids, killing so many of our fellow Canadians. And the then laundered proceeds are invested in Canadian real estate, helping to price us out of our own housing market. We have, moreover, been complacent in the face of foreign efforts to coerce and intimidate Canadian citizens and residents seeking to alert Canadians to the dangers posed by China, Russia, and other authoritarian regimes. China has the resources and the will to go beyond just destabilizing information, however. They have been pursuing for years the further policy of suborning a wide range of Canadian institutions. To do so, they have employed the traditional tactics for exploiting human weakness, such as divided loyalties, the fear engendered by threats and intimidation, the active corruption of institutions by the placement within them of agents loyal to Beijing, and that old standby, greed. Before I get into the details, let me respond to the old canard that there is nothing special happening in Canada. The disinformation and the suborning of institutions by China is just as prevalent in the United States, for example, as it is in Canada. Rubbish. The United States has risen impressively, if slowly, to these challenges, although there is assuredly more to be done. It has provided extraordinary levels of support to Ukraine, although a Trump presidential victory may change that. It has spearheaded and embraced innovative arrangements such as the Quad, which brings together India, Japan, Australia, and the United States, and AUKUS, which brings together Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, to create an embryonic security apparatus in the Indo-Pacific. They've helped to create bilateral defense cooperation agreements and NATO expansion to deter Russian aggression in Europe. Moreover, it has become the world's largest oil producer and LNG exporter, providing a lifeline to a Europe desperate to reduce its reliance on Russian gas. Canada, in marked contrast, is fast becoming an honorary third world country from a national security point of view. This is due, at least in part, to a benign neglect of Canada by Washington, thereby encouraging the belief that Canada could blithely embrace China and indulge in petty diaspora politics with impunity. Our contribution to joint continental defense via NORAD is dilapidated, while Russian and Chinese advances in hypersonic weapon systems are making North America vulnerable. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Canada announced it would spend $5 billion over 6 years to improve our capabilities. But progress is, to say the least, glacial. The will to buy desperately needed new weapon systems is lacking, hence the several decades it took us to decide to purchase F-35 fighters, and those fighters have not been bought yet. When the leaders of Japan and Germany came and begged Canada to make more of its abundant energy resources available, they were sent away empty-handed. Apparently, there is a business case for giving Germany, a German industry in the form of VW, $13 billion to build a $7 billion battery plant, but the Prime Minister assures there is no business case for exporting Canadian gas to Germany, despite having been begged to do so by no less a personage than the German Chancellor. Canada's military spending is 2/3 of NATO's target of 2% of GDP and a fraction of the United States' 3.5%. Canada's just retired top soldier, General Wayne Eyre, lamented a couple of years ago that he doubts our capacity to lead a mission to Haiti because our military is already stretched thin by its modest contribution to Ukraine and our leadership of the NATO mission in Latvia. Compare this to the renewed commitment of Australia and the UK under AUKUS to buy new nuclear submarines, embrace unprecedented levels of technological and command cooperation, and to increase greatly their military spending in consequence. Or compare the enthusiastic embrace of NATO by Sweden and Finland, countries whose now abandoned neutralist foreign policy was a siren song to Canada's foreign policy elites. Canada's response to these shifts has been tepid, slow, condescending, and above all, toothless. Once upon a time, Canada's absence from, say, AUKUS or the Quad might have been explained by the political sensitivities of being seen to be too close to the United States and the need to manage the independence movement in Quebec. These traditional explanations are now taking a back seat to revelations of the extent of China's penetration of Canada's institutions at every level, including political parties. And Canada's security services have been sounding the alarm on China's growing interference and nefarious activities for decades. Indifference and hostility were official Ottawa's response. Recently leaked intelligence assessments that the Chinese Communist Party's United Front operatives were working actively to influence the results of elections at every level have finally caused the public to take notice of the Chinese Communist Party's clandestine activities. Justin Trudeau's government has responded to reports of interference with obstruction, obfuscation, and minor concessions. The mere potential of widespread interference should be reason enough for investigation, but the Liberal Party has badly mishandled the response, with Mr. Trudeau engaging in transparent denial and finger pointing. He's dodged questions about his knowledge of the foreign interference and simultaneously stoutly assured us that it didn't affect the outcome of the elections in, quote, a significant way. How he knows this in the absence of a proper and thorough investigation is mysterious, to put it gently. So I know that we're starting to run out of time, and you're anxious to get to the question period for all the speakers who have gone before me this afternoon. There are a couple of things I want to say in addition to my criticism of the current federal government in response to Chinese interference in Canadian society. I feel the need to note that no one should be under any illusions that the Tories are any less tainted by Chinese influence than the Liberals. The elite capture orchestrated by Beijing reaches right across the political spectrum. And to China's attacks on our elections must be added other assaults on our democratic institutions, and chief amongst these is the recently revealed plan by China to threaten and intimidate the Hong Kong family of a Chinese-Canadian conservative MP, Michael Chong, in explicit retaliation for his leadership of the successful effort to have China's treatment of its Uyghur minority declared a genocide by Canada's Parliament. Our democracy isn't the only Canadian institution under siege. There has been no public accounting of events at Canada's infectious diseases lab, where Chinese scientists appear to have been sharing research secrets with Chinese authorities. Charges were recently dismissed against an agricultural scientist accused of being paid to deliver Canadian lab research to China. Why were the charges dismissed? Because the RCMP officer charged with preparing the case was told to work from home during the pandemic, and the clock ran out. I don't know about anybody else, but that puts me in mind of Lucien Rivard's famous escape from a Montreal jail when he persuaded the authorities at the prison that he should be allowed out to water the prison ice rink, even though the temperature was well above freezing. I could tell you about the suborning of Canadian universities and the agreements between the Chinese Minister of Science and Technology and various Canadian universities, researchers, the way in which the United Front Department of the Chinese Communist Party controls all of the research effort going on in China and their partnerships with foreign universities. There's much more that we could say. Ottawa, of course, wants Canadian businesses to be able to tap into the world's largest market. But the price of this access appears to be ignoring Beijing's Canadian agenda, from military and industrial espionage to harassing Canadian Uyghurs, Tibetans, Falun Gong practitioners, and ethnic Chinese and Taiwanese people who reject Beijing's hectoring that they should be loyal to China instead of to Canada. And speaking of business, one more Canadian group that deserves to be called out in this sad litany of institutional leadership failure is Canada's business elite. The late David Kilgour told me personally that when he was appointed Minister of State for Asia Pacific in the Chrétien years, his first visit was from a representative of the Prime Minister's office who wanted to make sure that David would not get any ideas above his lowly ministerial station about relations with China. Our policy toward China, he was told in no uncertain terms, is not set at our foreign ministry or the Prime Minister's office, but at the headquarters of Power Corporation in Montreal. And Power Corporation is, of course, perhaps the leading Canadian corporate investor in China. Unless you think that this is merely the liberal Laurentian elite talking, rest assured that my experience was no different among the Western energy industry's leadership. I was persona non grata with them for several years after my institute led the battle against the Chinese National Overseas Oil Corporation's bid to acquire Nexen. It was made crystal clear to me that any national security concerns Canada might have needed to take a back seat to Nexen and any later oil patch sales fetching top dollar from the Chinese. I'm sorry to say I refused to shut up. And as a result, the government of Canada changed its policy on acquisitions in the oil patch. I could go on and on about the extent to which our own allies are losing faith in Canada as an intelligence, strategy, and military ally because of the extent to which our institutions have been compromised. I'm sure you can imagine. Job one for America is rallying the liberal democracies against the depredations of Chinese-led authoritarians. Yet Washington faces the very real possibility that its northern neighbor won't just fail to shoulder its share of the load. Our institutions may be so compromised as to be unable to act in the interests of the West. So Ottawa's complacence on the matter of the rot in our institutions endangers not only Canadians, but the solidity of the foreign relationship that matters more to us than all the others put together. And that, of course, is the Canada-US relationship. So to sum up, job one of any government is to defend its citizens from foreign threats, a task at which Ottawa has been failing miserably. So what's to do? Here's my short list. Because China launders a great deal of money in Canada, including from supplying the raw materials that become the opioids now devastating our population, and they use that laundered money to price Canadians out of their own cities, we need to strengthen anti-money laundering laws and enforcement. As a matter of urgency, we need to have a foreign agents registry, and I'm glad to say, as a result of all the pressure that we've brought to bear on Ottawa, foreign agents registry is now happening, and I think we can take some major credit for that. We must immediately dispense with the farcical efforts to investigate Chinese interference in our political institutions and in our elections. I'm willing to wait to hear from Justice Hogue about her inquiry, but I have to say that I think that her effort is already badly compromised. But when it reports that the Hogue Commission should reveal all it can about the genesis, the evolution, and the extent of influence operations of both China and Russia on our soil, including, by the way, the names of compromised politicians in Canada, so that Canadians can be informed about how they and their leadership were misled and misinformed about what was going on, so that we will be less credulous in the future. We must beef up the capacity of our intelligence and armed forces to combat cybersecurity threats. We must treat our natural resources not only as the national treasure that they are, but as a buttress for the democratic world against economic pressure such as Russia and China have both tried to exercise by dominating markets for energy in Europe and strategic minerals globally. Finally, we need a plan to ensure that legitimate free trade is not used as a cover for the deindustrialization of our economy and the transfer of thousands of jobs to China. It is not free trade when national governments use their country's companies as instruments of foreign and security policy. It is entirely possible to be both hard-headed free traders and staunch defenders of Canada's national interests. I know that's an ambitious agenda, but the times and the safety of Canadians and the integrity of our institutions require nothing less. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Holy smokes, what a litany of, shall we say, bad news. But in any event, we're glad to have it. You certainly have articulated it well. We have a few questions. Doug, go ahead.
There's a lot to unpack there, isn't there? Just a quick question. You know, Volodymyr Zelensky's term in office expired some time ago, and he's canceled elections since then. So is it actually accurate to continue to refer to Ukraine as a democracy?
Well, you know, it's not unusual in democracies to have the capacity to delay elections in wartime. The United Kingdom did it. I think that it's not the ideal. You know, I would prefer that there were elections, but, you know, I have to say that when a country is fighting for its life, as Ukraine is against Russia, and the leadership was elected in a democratic process, and they have used legitimate means to extend the life of their government because they can't even hold elections in part of their territory, which is occupied by Russia. I think we should give them the benefit of the doubt. And I have to say that I think it is part of Russia's misinformation campaign against the West to try and undermine Ukraine's claim to be a democracy. I have to say that's the pot calling the kettle black. The president of Ukraine was elected by a genuine democratic process. Unlike the president of Russia, and as I say, I think we should give them the benefit of the doubt.
Okay, good enough. Let's get a different. Go ahead, Tex. Thank you, Brian.
Yeah.
Brian, first of all, everything you said about China is absolutely correct. Everything you've said about Russia is absolutely wrong. Let me explain why I say that. First of all, America has been a warmonger for the last 40 years. America started this war when they pulled off the coup in 2014 and decided that they were going to move NATO right toward the Russian border. I served with NATO in Germany, and as far as I have a question. My question is, how did you arrive at your mistaken presentation about Russia and the Ukraine war?
Well, I arrived at it by actually consulting the facts as opposed to an imaginary history, which you clearly taken straight from Vladimir Putin's website. I'm not even going to dignify it with a further response than that.
Thanks, Brian. We're certain, you can tell we've had a long afternoon, and we're getting ready for wine time here. So let's all keep calm. Roger, do you have a question? Let's hope so. Yeah, go ahead, Roger.
Hi, Brian. My name is Roger Song. I came from China. Thanks very much for your presentation. But I was wondering whether when you're saying China, what you're really saying is the Chinese Communist Party. Because based on my experience, my life in China, I saw that Chinese people is also the victim of the Chinese Communist Party. Chinese has no saying in their foreign policy, in their relationship with China. Actually, the Chinese people has a very good feeling about Chinese. That's why when I cannot tolerate the regime in the Communist Party, I choose to come to China, not to go to India, go to the the other African country, right? So I was wondering whether you would agree with me when you're saying China. Actually, you're talking about the totalitarian regime, the Communist Party, which is based on this Marxism ideology. Thank you.
Roger, I completely accept your comment. I plead guilty to using the shorthand of saying China when I mean the regime in China, which is a regime controlled by, as you quite properly say, the Chinese Communist Party. And I repeatedly talked about the United Front Work Department, which is, the foreign representation of the political side of the Chinese Communist Party. China's ambitions for Taiwan, for example, are the ambitions of the Chinese Communist Party. I completely agree with you that Canada's adversary here is not the Chinese people. Canada's adversary is the regime in China, and I can't tell you how many Chinese friends I have here in Canada who are frightened and dismayed to see the extent to which the regime in China is reaching into our institutions and causing things to happen which very often these people left China to escape. So we need to be very mindful of the malign intentions of the regime in China, but never to confuse the regime and the people of China. So
thank you, Brian. I don't know if you can hear it. You're getting a good round of applause for that. I think we're all I think we're clear on that. Michelle?
I'm interested in whether or not you think that John Mearsheimer is a Putin agent, and his view on the Ukraine-Russia situation is somehow made-up propaganda. He's a historian, as you probably know. And also, what do you think about China's plan to be the world dominant power by 2049, which is only 1 year short of net zero 2050?
Well, look, I'm not an expert on his particular view on this. I don't know if you want to expand on what you think the main points are. What I will say is, you know, as a general take on Ukraine and Russia and NATO, the idea that somehow Ukraine promised never to become part of NATO, or that NATO promised never to bring Ukraine into NATO membership, I think is completely fictional. There was an agreement that Ukraine would give up nuclear weapons in exchange for a guarantee of its territorial integrity. Because as we know, under the USSR, a number of nuclear weapons were stationed on the territory of Ukraine. Ukraine gave up those nuclear weapons in exchange for a guarantee by all parties that its territorial integrity would not be challenged. We all know that Russia challenged that integrity first by invading Ukraine, second by invading eastern Ukraine. As far as I'm concerned, any agreements with the Soviet Union and its successor states is completely canceled by the behavior of Russia. And Ukraine is a sovereign state, is entitled to decide what clubs it wants to belong to, including NATO, if it is necessary to protect its territorial integrity. So those are my general thoughts about it. I don't know if you wanted to add something about his particular thoughts.
I think that Ukraine attacked Russian citizens in Donbass, and I think that Putin invoked Article 5. So I think that this is not a clear-cut case, and I recommend that people look at the John Mearsheimer presentations that he's done on the situation. So anyway, on to the China question.
Brian?
Yes.
Brian, would you just, I think we've had a pretty good discussion here. I think you've certainly woke everybody up in the room. I can tell you that. And I'm happy for that, and I appreciate all you've done. But how about if we sort of let's stop there. We've came here to have what I would call I think you're happy with that too. I'm pretty sure you are. But I think we've all come in here to have sort of an intelligent, respectful discussion about the future of Canada and Alberta. We're talking about hopefully getting out of Canada without having to go to war. So let's not get argued amongst ourselves over a war on a foreign land. We might have one here if we're not careful. So I'm not going to let you ask a question, Ian. I think we're just absolute. Is it a really quick one? Okay, it can't be a comment. It has to be a question. Okay, go ahead.
We are currently in a war with BRICS. Our currency is at risk. Who wrote Dreaming with BRICS, The Path to 2050? Could you answer that, please?
I have no idea who wrote that.
You and me both, Brian, but we'll try and find an answer over wine later, and we'll let you know too. And so, Vince, I'm pretty sure you're coming up here to change the subject. We're going to draw a name out of the hat. Somebody's going to win a book. We're all going to live happily ever after here in our future country. Yes, good. Let me draw the name and.
Okay, so they have to be here in the room.
They have to be here in the room. If you've gone out, yeah.
We'll count to count to three. And
okay.
Three calls.
Okay.
Okay,
John Hobb, are you here in the room? No, John Hobb isn't here because of. Okay. Well, are you?
Funny-looking John.
John Hobb looks a lot better than the last time I saw him. I want to know what you're eating for supper. Yeah. Okay. We'll take it since he's here. Okay, fair enough. Is that fair enough? It's your book.
Yes.
Okay, good. John Hobb is with Parents for Choice, and this is his more beautiful. Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, thank you very much. We have so anyway. That's all good. Thank you, Vince. Now Vince is working on a whole bunch of projects back there. Not the least of which is honoring his his father, which that's going to be what date? September 25th. They're going to have a big thing, honoring the late Ted Byfield. Yes. I love quoting Ted. He said the socialists seem to have like what is it? He just has. They're just seem to be totally unable to foresee the logical consequences of their actions. And he said if they had their own way, they'd be hungry in any place where they ever have had. They are. And so, but anyway, we won't belabor that for the moment. So we've had a pretty good day. It's 5 o'clock. We're supposed to. Well, it's just before 5. We've got. Shauna Sundale. Shauna, are you here somewhere? Shauna, yeah, Shauna's at the back room. She's actually she's the back of the room. She's the executive director of the Irreplaceable Parent Project, which when Mateo was talking, she said, well, if there's any parents or grandparents here that want to talk about their project, she's going to be here. If we have a little bit of time tomorrow, we might hear a couple of words from her, but we're pretty tight for time. I think. Art, do we want to talk about, Art was talking about something that pretty much followed from what Brian Crowley was talking about, which was how totally and completely the bureaucracy has been, I don't know how to say it, they're sort of running everything. I'm just going to give Art about 3 or 4 minutes to talk about just how this is all coming together and to a certain extent what we should all know about it. So go ahead, Art. You can read your notes. I'll hold the mic for you, or you can hold it yourself if you like.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Danny. So often the question comes up in our freedom groups is how did the administrative state receive so much power to enact mandates, to put these matters forward and put suppression down upon the people, and it seemed like the elected representatives are powerless to do anything about it. And I think one of the best explanations I have seen so far, and it's come up just about in every single presentation, one form or another, where the administrative state takes control. But if you wanted to all pay attention to the National Citizens Inquiry that took place in Toronto, look for the testimonies of Professor Bruce Pardy, P-A-R-D-Y. And he explains it in very simplistic form of what happened. There's the executive branch, or the elected branch, the administrative branch, and the courts. And what happened that allowed the administrative branch to take so much power and to keep that power and to use their executive authority to push down on people in this country. In any event, I would suggest you look at it, and if there's other questions that do come up, he will answer many, but not all of those points. But it all comes back down to sort of like as he puts it, an administration, or the triumph of the administrative state versus the elected officials. And where does the charter, how come the charter does not protect us, but rather has been turned around to oppose anything that protects individual rights? So I think this is very important for all to listen.
Let's take his question. Go ahead, Doug. Do you have a question?
Thanks very much. This is an excellent topic, really good. Our EDA actually interviewed Bruce Pardy after the NCI testimony, and you'll find his work at rightsprobe.org. He's a brilliant academic, law prof in one of the universities down in Toronto.
Good. Well, if anybody has more questions on that, they can talk to either Doug or Art, over lunch and then after supper. But I think, Art, you make a really good point. It's like, quite frankly, we have been betrayed by our elected people. Just a little over half a lifetime ago, I was the chairman of the Alberta Beef Producers, and I was pretty young at the time, and we had an even younger. We just hired a new executive director, and so we were having an executive meeting. When the executive meeting was over, I said to him, "So what are you doing after lunch?" He said, "Oh, we're interviewing ladies for the new PR job." And I said, well, there's only 3 of us on the executive, me, the vice chairman, and the finance chairman. I said, why don't we sit in on the interviews? He said, oh, no. He said, the general manager hires the staff. And I said, oh, I know that. But I said, if we don't like who you hire, we'll probably fire you. And he thought for a minute, and he said, why don't you sit in on the interviews? And we hired somebody who worked for us for 30 years. But I mean, like you look at these people that get elected, they go there and they say, oh, we can't comment on that. We just set general policy, and then the administration does every other bloody thing. And look at the mess it's got us into. So anyway, thank you, Art. If anybody wants to get the link to parties, between us, we might have to get a young person to come up here and get the glasses. Anyway, okay. I think it's well, just before we all leave, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but it's only 164 days till Christmas. And if you haven't bought books for your grandchildren, Michael and Ivy Wagner are back. Yeah, we've got a whole bunch of people here selling their books. So be sometime over the course of this evening. Michael's got a new book coming out. I think it's just on Kindle so far. It's called No Other Option. He has a couple on separation. The one is, actually, the No Other Option is already out. I actually quite like this book, and it's not just because he dedicated it to me. It's a really good book as well. But in any event, he has a new book coming out called Time to Leave. It's on Kindle, but hopefully it'll be out in time for Christmas, so you can give everybody that you love in your family a copy of his book for Christmas. So I think we've had a pretty interesting day. We've got a couple hours for supper, and then Maxime Bernier is going to be talking to us about, I guess you want to call it, the threat of mass immigration. And so I think that's just another one on the list of things that we're concerned about, and I think, quite frankly, we've been betrayed by our leadership on. But in any event, let's take a couple hours for supper. We'll all be back here at 7 o'clock, and we'll get to hear from Maxime Bernier. So thank you very much.